Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining early. We'll just give a little less than a minute for other attendees to join, and we will start shortly. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub Nigeria webinar on establishing disability inclusive reporting mechanisms in Nigeria. I am Sylvia Nwoko, currently serving as the Communications Officer with the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub Nigeria. Please be informed that we have available closed captioner. You can access the closed caption function feature by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Today's webinar will be looking at improving reporting of safeguarding and PSEA concerns amongst persons with disabilities through raising awareness on the need for organizations in Nigeria to apply the disability lens when setting up reporting mechanisms. In this webinar also, we will disseminate the RSH Nigeria's new product as a way of empowering organizations to operationalize this how-to note on establishing disability inclusive reporting mechanisms in Nigeria. To achieve these webinar objectives, we have 4 amazing speakers who will talk us through each key part of this webinar. Our first speaker is Oluchi Ihedero. Oluchi is the national representative of the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub in Nigeria. He brings 11 years of dedicated experience in the aid sector and is a safeguarding expert. She leads the national delivery team, ensures successful program delivery, aligns with the global team, and focuses on improving safeguarding policies and practices. She has extensive experience supporting civil society organizations globally, providing expertise in capacity building, system strengthening, and accountability programs. Oluchi's presentation will focus on disability inclusive safeguarding and will highlight safeguarding and disability inclusion, looking at why it is important to safeguard persons with disabilities. She will also look at some safeguarding reporting risks to consider for persons with disabilities and their recommended channels for reporting. And finally, her presentation would also look at RSH's effort towards a disability inclusive safeguarding. Our second speaker is Dr. Adedeji Peter Ademefun. Dr. Deji is a development expert with 14 years of experience in gender, women's and girls' rights, and disability inclusion. He specializes in safeguarding principles, empowering vulnerable populations, and promoting feminist agenda, the rights of women and girls in Nigeria. Deji has held leadership roles, including co-chair of Action Aid International Women's Rights Working Group, and represented the senior management team in the Safeguarding and Share Committee at CBM Global. He manages donor funds from an intersectionality perspective and supports civil society and community-based organizations. He holds a PhD in political economy and development studies and certifications in project management, business development, and research. His presentation will focus on developing the reporting mechanisms and will highlight the 12 steps to establish disability-inclusive safeguarding reporting mechanisms, as well as barriers that organizations in Nigeria may face when establishing disability-inclusive reporting mechanisms and how to approach them. Our third speaker is Madam Lois Alta. Madam Lois is a creative business executive specializing in disability inclusion and development. She holds a BSc in public administration from the University of Abuja and various certificates in global business, project management, and sustainability. She is currently the global president, founder, and CEO of Network of Women with Disabilities, a global-owned network where she is responsible for steering the development and empowerment of women and girls with disabilities on major thematic areas. She's an award winner locally and globally. Madam Lois is a polio survivor who uses a wheelchair to navigate her way of challenging the status quo, and a woman with multiple abilities who inspires the world. Madam Lois's presentation will focus on discussing the relevance of disability-inclusive safeguarding reporting mechanisms and will highlight practical challenges which may prevent persons with disabilities from reporting safeguarding concerns. And finally, we have our fourth speaker, Mr. Solomon Okelola. Mr. Solomon is the Executive Director of Lionheart Ability Leaders International Foundation, LALIF, a non-governmental organization in Nigeria for people with disabilities, advocating for people with disabilities. He organizes awareness campaigns and emphasizes the unique challenges faced by those who are deaf-blind. With a master's degree in special education and rehabilitation science from the University of Ibadan. Despite personal challenges, Mr. Solomon has become a strong advocate for the early detection of Usher syndrome, the world's leading cause of deaf blindness, and more training and awareness in the mainstream schools. Mr. Solomon's presentation will also focus on discussing the relevance of disability-inclusive safeguarding reporting mechanism. And he will highlight also practical challenges which may prevent persons with disabilities from reporting safeguarding concerns. Now that you have had a preview of our distinguished speakers for this webinar, here are a few housekeeping details to keep in mind. First, you are all on mute with your videos turned off. This is to support with the quality and connection of the webinar. Please be aware that we will be recording this webinar to share on the online hub afterwards for anyone who was not able to join. Your names will not be visible. Please also be advised that this webinar contains content on safeguarding that some may find distressing. If you would like to ask any questions during the live question and answer session, please add them to the Q&A function throughout the webinar. You can find the Q&A function in the controls panel at the bottom of your screen. You can add new questions or upvote any existing questions. We will try to cluster them in order to answer as many of them as possible. And now, without further ado, I now hand over the floor to our first speaker, Oluchi Ihedero. Oluchi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Good morning, everyone, and good to have you all join us today in this webinar. My name is Oluchi Ihedero, as Sylvia rightly mentioned, and today we'll be looking at the importance of establishing disability inclusive reporting mechanism, as you've been rightly informed. The Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub is huge on supporting organizations to strengthen their safeguarding systems and practices to prevent sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and other safeguarding concerns from being exhibited to the people that we are there to protect. That is our main objective, right? And safeguarding has three key pillars. The first one is the prevention, the second one is the reporting, and the third one is the response. I like to always emphasize when discussing with organizations that in as much as these three key pillars are very important in effective safeguarding implementation at organizations, the reporting, which is the middle one, has more strength for me, right? It has more strength. It weighs in on strengthening the effectiveness of the first, which is prevention, and the second, which is response. Now, the reason is this. If you have an effective reporting mechanism, it goes a great length in strengthening the preventative measures that you've put in place. When organization members know that you have a strong reporting mechanism, that when reports are sent, you respond to it, you act on it, they will be more careful to ensure that they do not exhibit unacceptable behaviors. The same way your organization members, the program participants, will be happy to utilize the reporting mechanisms, and that helps you in preventing. The same applies to the response. If you do not have a strengthened safeguarding reporting mechanism, you will not have complaints or safeguarding reports that you can respond to. So having a strong reporting mechanism, the importance of that can never be overemphasized. Now, the question is, how effective can your reporting mechanisms be when it is not disability inclusive? So for you to say you have an effective reporting mechanism, you should be able to respond to the needs of all your program participants, including persons with disabilities. Now, who are these persons with disability? And on my screen, you can see that disability means impairment plus barriers. And according to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, these people are those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Summarily, persons with impairment are humans. They are humans like every one of us. They have their capacities, their abilities, their capabilities. They have lots of unique things that they can also contribute to the society. But what makes them persons with disabilities are the external factors which poses different levels of barriers to them. Factors that come from you and I, maybe because of our lack of knowledge or our ignorance on how to interact, associate, and support these persons with unique impairments. And that makes them more vulnerable, and that makes them persons with disability. So what is the question and what is the call? That all of us would actively and intentionally work with the persons with different impairments and support them to participate effectively and actively in the society and in our organizations where they find themselves. Next slide, Sylvia. Now, why is it important to safeguard persons with disabilities? As I mentioned earlier, have unique needs because of their different types of impairments, and there are some societal barriers that might limit them from participating actively in the society. And these societal barriers can make them more vulnerable to safeguarding concerns such as sexual abuse, neglect, harm, sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, you name them. And another contributory factor is because of the societal barriers, they face stigma and discrimination, and also face the challenge of, would they believe me? So that fear of not being sure of whether they will be believed when they review the concerns that they have, or whether the right actions will be taken, make them more vulnerable. And that is why organizations are called to be intentional and deliberate in factoring in the unique needs of these persons with disabilities when establishing reporting mechanisms to ensure that they are accessible and inclusive enough for them to utilize. Next slide. Now, for the purpose of this webinar, next slide, Sylvia, the RSH Nigeria Hub recognize the importance of ensuring that our reporting mechanisms are inclusive enough, and we developed a resource document that will help organizations be more informed on how to go about this. And we're also proactive to showcase some of the challenges that organizations might face when they are establishing these disability inclusive reporting mechanisms, and then suggested some helpful options that organizations can apply to make it disability inclusive. And this is just a sneak peek of the table that we have in this resource document. It is already in the chat box. You can click on that afterwards for more information on how to go about this. But looking at the table, you can see that I've just put in some of the different types of impairments, the deaf, the visual impairment, the deaf-blind, and some of the safeguarding risks they face, with some helpful reporting channels that organizations can apply to help them participate in the organization. So please feel free to visit this document and explore on some of these helpful channels. Next slide. Like I said earlier, we've all been called to, in our own context, in our communities, in our organizations, to intentionally and deliberately provide enabling environments that persons with disabilities can be in and thrive, exhibiting their unique characteristics and abilities. And this call applies as well to all organizations here in ensuring that your reporting mechanisms are disability inclusive. RSH has taken a lead on this, and we modeled to you how these things can be done by living it out in our programming. So when we started, we struck a partnership with the Joint National Association of Persons with Disabilities, JONAPID, to understand the safeguarding needs of organizations of persons with disabilities, organizations for persons with disabilities, and the persons with disabilities themselves. And this partnership resulted into a research being conducted to understand how OPDs and OFPDs are keeping people safer. And with this research, a lot of findings were obtained, a lot of gaps, a lot of needs on how organizations can intensify their systems to keep people safe. And RSH as well went as far as providing recommendations to organizations on how these needs can be met. This research, the research findings and the recommendations were published on our website. The link is in the chat. Sylvia will drop that in the chat shortly. And we also produce hard copies in the normal version and in Braille versions so that other persons can as well access it and get the learnings from there. And as part of our programs, we model and promote disability inclusive safeguarding strategies among organizations in Nigeria by ensuring representation of persons with disability on our national expert board. The NEB serves as the advisory board that advises the hub on how to provide our services to meet the needs of our audience. And we ensured that we have a representative of persons with disability on this hub to also bring in the perspectives of PWDs. And you'll be hearing from her shortly. And that is Lois that was earlier introduced. And we always conduct what we call the 6-month mentorship program to organizations on building their safeguarding systems and practices. And for this, so far since we started, we've supported 4 organizations of persons with disabilities, as well as supported 1 OPD through the Ask an Expert service on safeguarding support. We've developed and published disability-focused resources. The links will be shared shortly in the chat box. We host disability inclusive webinars. So for all our webinars, we ensure that we have the closed captioning where you have the text for persons with hearing impairment to go through with the webinar. And in some of our webinars, we have this in combination with the sign language interpreter, as you will see in this webinar that we are currently holding, to ensure that everyone is included and that everyone understands what is being discussed. And again, we intentionally encourage organizations to discuss this issue of disability inclusion in their programming and help them to figure out, think about what they can do, how they can go about it, the challenges they may have, and practical ways that they can surmount those challenges. And these are the models, the practical steps that we are taking, and calling on other organizations to as well key into this to enable the environment for the organization to be disability friendly and inclusive for the persons with disabilities. And lastly, the last slide, please. I would like to leave you all with these 4 key points in summary. And the first one is that persons with disabilities are firstly humans with potentials like everyone else, just require some reasonable support from us to deal with the societal barriers and live better. Secondly, every one of us here and every organization has a responsibility to keeping persons with disability safer. Thirdly, organizations have increased role to play in changing the narrative, improving the well-being and safety of persons with disability. And lastly, organizations must strive towards promoting positive organizational culture where do no harm principle is consciously applied by all when supporting persons with disability, but they have an enabling environment to thrive and share and speak up with the concerns that they have. Thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you everyone for listening. Back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Oluchi, for that very insightful and impactful information and presentation. And now let's welcome our next speaker, Dr. Deji, who will continue to build on these important insights. Deji, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. This helpful and excellent setting the tone, Oluchi. So this time we'll be talking basically about, so what practical steps and guidance do we need in establishing a reporting mechanism within organizations? And basically, we'll be looking at how to improve those reporting mechanisms, what are the steps to take, and what would be exigent to improve the system. And this is important to meet the safety, inclusion, and accessibility and confidentiality needs of persons with disabilities within organizational systems and structures. So I'll be talking about quickly 12 practical steps in establishing disability inclusive safeguarding and reporting mechanism. But the caveat is these 12 steps are not all exclusive. There are more strategies, but these are steps that have really worked and practically within organizations of and for persons with disabilities. So in talking about the steps, the first thing that is important is the governance level conversation in terms of securing the leadership commitment within your civil society organization. Within your DPO, within your OPD, it is exigent that the leadership of the organization have a buy-in into setting up a reporting mechanism for persons with disabilities, because that will be important for decision level making and structures that are important to drive the operationalization of such policies and processes. The second thing that is important is a co-creative process with persons with disabilities themselves. Of course, the popular motto, nothing about us without us, relies on the principles of participation and inclusion. So you do not set up a reporting mechanism without adequately engaging with the clusters of persons with disabilities across these different clusters. The third thing that is important is, of course, agreeing on the internal process for handling reports when they come in tandem with the do no harm principle and a need basis, which is exigent to ensure a survivor-centered approach for cases that have been reported around safeguarding issues. The first step, again, just to say, not in a particular chronological order, but to ensure that mechanisms are in place to ensure confidentiality. Like I said, this is important to, do no further harm to the person with disability or the incident that has been reported. Process for sharing information only limited to those that need to know and the actions that are required to be taken in that regard. The fifth step is it is exigent to continually map quality of organizations of persons with disabilities that can support services such as sign language interpretation for the deaf, tactile communication for the deaf-blind, the guide cane and assistive technologies, and implement the JAWS for all clusters of persons with disabilities, the magnifying lens for persons with albinism. So it's important to map those organizations that can provide such services. Relatedly, it's also exigent to map organizations that can provide support services in terms of financial, legal, psychosocial services, medical, child protection, law enforcement agencies. There are instances where cases safeguarding issues that relates to persons with disabilities have had to be referred to the law courts, and all of those services need to be planned as part of your setting up your safeguarding reporting mechanism. It is also exigent to train all staff on disability inclusive safeguarding. Right abuse can continue to subsist if people don't know that it's actually an abuse. For instance, you may be trying to assist a person on wheelchair by trying to lift the person off the wheelchair, but without that consent, it could become a safeguarding concern. So there's need for increased training for all staff and the community that the organization relate with. It's also exigent to establish protocols for responding to reports of misconduct, which are to be taken seriously, investigated, and then addressed promptly, so we don't have a recurrence of such safeguarding concern, particularly for clusters of persons with disabilities. Again, it is exigent that in setting up your safeguarding reporting mechanism, all materials are accessible as possible in tandem with the UNCRPD standard as required, raising awareness among stakeholders, regularly reviewing report mechanism with clusters to ensure that the policies and mechanism in place is still relevant to the changing context of the disability community. Again, the last one, not the least, is to also document lessons, good practices that could be used to improve the reporting and safeguarding mechanisms. So very quickly, I'm going to switch to talking about some of the barriers that organizations may face in establishing inclusive reporting mechanism and how to approach them. The first one is around policy. If there's no policy that guides a framework that protects the rights of persons with disability, abuse will be inevitable. So it's exigent to have disability inclusive safeguarding policy. And that's why the leadership buy-in is exigent from get-go, because that policy will need to be operationalized. People will need to understand, improve their knowledge around the policy, understand the reporting mechanism, and then be able to address gaps that may arise stemming from the legal framework that the organization operates. Another one that's exigent is in terms of accessibility for all clusters of persons with disability. And in accessibility, we are talking about structural and assistive communication barriers that could exist that the organization needs to address from get-go. For instance, if you talk about inaccessible buildings, how do you protect the right of a person with disability who needs to access the facility and engage constructively when when your office space is, for instance, on the first step or on the first floor, the second floor, without no lift, no ramp spaces and all of that. So those are very exigent. No matter how intelligent a deaf person would have contributed to a conversation, if there's no sign language interpreter or some other assistive devices that help them participate actively, then they have been excluded. The third one that is exigent, again, is in terms of affordability. And I'd like to talk about this a bit because a lot of organizations scare away from entrenching inclusion within their system because of the cost. In terms of cost, it is exigent to, of course, again, establishing disability inclusive safeguarding reporting channel from a cost basis that allows the organization not only have policies that sit in the organizational shelves packing the dust, but policies that can be operable and can be implemented, backed by effective finances to drive those policies. So in terms of availability, we are going to procure the JAWS for the blind that can speak to them on their assistive devices and supportive device. So it's important to begin to think about affordability. And that's one barrier that organizations should surmount in designing their safeguarding reporting mechanism. The other one is around adaptability. You need to understand the context, be able to fit your safeguarding reporting mechanism within your country, iterate lessons, improve on those lessons, and ensure that all barriers around services and responsive systems are addressed from the design and putting up the safeguarding mechanism. The last one I would like to talk about quickly, or the penultimate one, is about acceptability. Again, there are attitudinal barriers that lead to exclusion of persons with disabilities. So it is exigent that this safeguarding mechanism is guided by the principle of free and informed consent, which is exigent to protect the rights of persons with disabilities. And with the UNCRPD standard, it is exigent to have the capacity to implement and maintain safeguarding standards that meet the needs of persons with disabilities by their clusters in terms of the quality that is exigent for operationalizing such safeguarding mechanism. I'd like to stop at that for now and then hand back over to Sylvia to take on the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Deji, for that very, very insightful presentation. And now, to further enrich our discussion, please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Madam Lois Alta. Madam Lois, please take the floor.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Lois Alta. I'm from the Cedar Seed Foundation. I'm also a member of the National Expert Board of RSH. In Nigeria, women and girls with disabilities are the most excluded, discriminated, and underrepresented in many sectors, including safeguarding issues. We are at the lowest and the most lowest level of inclusion. We suffer more when it comes to social barriers, social models. And these social models are exclusion, segregation, integration, and inclusion. At this level of safeguarding, where are we? Particularly for women and girls with disabilities. Gender-based violence, number one. Safeguarding issues, number one. So I'm so proud of this conversation this morning that I know the recommendations will be used in many organizations that will lead us to ensuring that safeguarding issues are highly prioritized in our organizations. And I want to share a story of one of us, a woman with disability. She's a survivor of gender-based violence. She was raped at age 17, and this resulted to unwanted pregnancy. The father of her child denied responsibility, and since then, she couldn't receive support from her family, friends, and well-wishers. She kept struggling for food and shelter to survive. She goes through suffering, poverty, and hardships in her day-to-day life. She subsequently faced lots of setbacks and unaccomplished dreams. According to her, her inability to report the sexual abuse incident to the relevant stakeholders or authorities was attributed to several factors, which include the following: fear of stigmatization, fear of the unknown, fear of discrimination. As a young woman with disability, she feared being judged by people around her or from the society. She further isolated herself from the public or being affected by her reputation. The second point is lack of financial resources. Because she was not working or she was not financially empowered, she couldn't take up legal actions against her abusers. She couldn't seek for help from the relevant authorities. And she could not afford legal fees or other necessary expenses. The third point is about power imbalance. The perpetrator denial and the lack of support from her immediate family likely contributed to her feeling powerless and unable to seek for justice. Women and girls with disabilities goes through infrastructural barrier, attitudinal barrier, and institutional barrier. And this led to her experiencing emotional trauma. Because of the abuse, the hardships, the challenges, the difficulties that she faced, it has overwhelmed her and making it difficult for her to take action or seek for help or seek for justice for the injustice that was done to her. Another one is lack of support from family, friends, and the community. Her initial attempts to seek help were not met because of rejection, leading her to feel unsupported and disheartened. And the last one is lack of awareness. She wasn't fully aware of her rights. She didn't know that this was her right to ask for justice, to take up the case with legal actors, to also ask relevant authorities to assist her in seeking for justice. at the time she was raped. So as we move on, we should make sure that women and girls with disabilities know their rights, right to sexual reproductive health, right to family planning, right to seek for justice when they are discriminated against or when injustice happened. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, and I hope to see the recommendations from this conversation being prioritized in our various organizations. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Madam Lois. We appreciate the clarity and depth that you have brought to this important topic. Let's now hear from our next speaker, Mr. Solomon, who will add another valuable perspective. Mr. Solomon, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you all today. The name is Solomon Kerola. Now I'm a deafblind, the executive director and Head Ability Leaders International Foundation. Time and time again, research has shown that persons with disabilities, especially women with disabilities, are 10 times more likely to experience abuse of all kinds, especially in the global south. In fact, the prevalence might be much more than what the available data shows. Why? Because a large number of persons with disabilities are not able to report safeguarding issues. And what are the challenges? What are the barriers that make it difficult for these persons to report safeguarding issues and the incidences of abuse they face? That is what I'll be talking about today, ladies and gentlemen. The first challenge faced by persons with disabilities is ignorance. Like the first speaker highlighted, many persons with disabilities are not even aware of their rights as members of the society. Because of their disability, they are usually made to feel as if they have to take whatever comes to them, as if they don't have a choice in their day-to-day life. They know nothing about the means of making any report of what happens to them when it is not something in their best interest. The second challenge faced by persons with disabilities is the fear or the uncertainty of what might happen. Would people really listen to them? Would the authorities really want to help them? It seems unlikely, especially in the face of the constant stigma and discrimination which many of them face on a daily basis. And so because of that, they tend to keep quiet. The third issue which many of them face, like Dr. Adedeji pointed out during his speech, is the inability to meet the high cost involved in reporting safeguarding issues. poverty and disability have been proven to be interchanging causes of each other. Because of the extreme economic situation in which most of them live, many persons with disabilities are financially handicapped, even if at all they want to make effort to report safeguarding issues. Now, we're talking about challenges faced by persons with disabilities, which they experience on personal basis, is different from challenges confronting persons with disabilities as a result of the society's attitude in which they live. If we talk of challenges confronting persons with disabilities, those are barriers over which they do not have any control. For instance, if I am ignorant of something, I can try to gain knowledge of it. But now when you talk of challenges confronting persons with disabilities, you talk about ignorance on the part of law officers, the police, and other authorities who are supposed to provide safeguarding services for persons with disabilities. They do not understand the nature or the needs of these persons when it comes to reporting. Many conclude that persons with disabilities can make use of the general means of reporting, which is not so. Secondly, there is a lot of issues when you talk of accessibility, confronting persons with disabilities in the bid to report safeguarding issues. And when you talk of accessibility issues, we have social. You can talk of social barriers, you talk of physical barriers, you talk of communication barriers. Social barriers have to do with the stigma, the discrimination which persons with disabilities face on a daily basis. Physical barriers have to do with the physical structures of reporting stations, and then communication barriers face especially the deaf and the deafblind. Now, in our bid to overcome these challenges, we have to work together in order to understand and to provide for the needs of persons with disabilities and make the society safe for everybody, with and without disabilities alike. And in that way, it is a work for everybody, which I hope we will all rise up to do together at once. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon. Your expertise and thoughtful perspectives have greatly enriched our discussion today. And now it is time to respond to questions from our audience. Remember to use the Q&A function to ask your question. So the first question we have here from Abayomi Erinoso. Please pardon me if I do not pronounce your name correctly. First of all, may I use this medium or opportunity to apologize to our audience and to explain the reason why our speaker, Mr. Solomon, did not have the RSH background. We encountered some technical difficulties in doing that. And because we're all joining in from different locations, we couldn't have a technical person on ground to assist to do that. Thank you for your understanding. We have a question here. This is a wonderful presentation. How is it possible for us to disable the chat option during the screen? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, that was not a question for the panelists. I'll go on to the next one. How from Joseph? I'm sorry, the questions just got muddled up right now. From Hadiza Bala, it says, I'm joining from Kano State. I appreciate being part of this important session. We have domesticated the action plan on women, peace, and security. Listening to this session has drawn a lot of attention on issues relating to disabilities. This policy document did it capture issues of disabilities? Let's talk of reporting mechanisms as one of the pillars. I think this is a great observation for us, and please advise on how to do that. May I direct this question to Mr. Deji? The question here is, does this document relating to disabilities, if this policy document captured issues of disabilities, talk less of reporting mechanisms as one of the pillars? I believe that is what Hadiza was trying to say. Otherwise, Hadiza, you can retype if I got that wrongly. Over to you, Mr. Deji. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Excellent question, Hadiza. Absolutely. And as said earlier, you could read the document that has been shared. On the document, it addresses specifically the needs and responding to the questions you've asked across the disability clusters. There's another question that I've responded to in the chat, asking how to calculate the cost when budgeting for a disability inclusive safeguarding mechanism and programming. And that's why we said in a presentation, it has to be a co-creative process with persons with disabilities, a user-centered perspective. They understand the issues better, and then you can, co-create that process of budgeting with them, and then you can address those challenges all together. I hope I've responded to that question. Many thanks. Back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you very much, Deji, for that very clear explanation and response. We have another question from Jennifer Yakubu. Please, how do we address the issue of caregiver or parents who discourage the survivors in seeking justice? Most time, when we pick up a case at the end of the day, the parents or caregivers will ask the survivors not to proceed with the case in seeking justice. Please, how do we address this issue? Because it's been a serious issue and a concern. I would direct this to Madam Lois. Would you care to respond to this? And any other panelists, Oluchi and Mr. Solomon, please jump in to answer these questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. But before I respond, I also want to add on the first question that was asked on UNSCR, that's United Nations Security Council resolutions. So another way of making this document inclusive is first by reviewing it, secondly, by also developing a disability policy, especially on safeguarding issues. That done will include issues of disability. Then on this question that you asked, Madam Oluchi.
Hello, thank you, Lois. Do you want me to jump in on that?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is from Jennifer on how we can pick up the case, right, despite the consent from the family members. So first of all, okay. I would like to, hello? So I would like to state that one of the things that could cause that might be ignorance of what the outcome might be, not being sure of what that outcome might be for the survivor. Another thing could be that they may not trust or have confidence in the system. I mean, your organization system, on how you'll be able to handle that. So the immediate recommendation would be proper sensitization to the survivor and the caregivers or the family members of the survivor to understand what the process is about, understand the risks that applies for the survivor on what they have faced, understand what your organization system has to offer and how you go about it, and then be able to secure their confidence to trust your system to handle that concern effectively. It is normal, even for persons without disability, to also opt out for not pushing forward the case. But that sensitization and building confidence is very important. Back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Oluchi, for doing justice to that question. I know we have loads and loads of questions on the quick Q&A box. We'll just take one last question. Please be assured that every question that has not been responded to on this live webinar will be responded to via our email when we are sending out all of these information to you. I will take one last question from Innocent Sony. How can persons with intellectual disabilities who cannot read and write report safeguarding issues? And I'd like to direct this to Mr. Solomon. Thank you. Just so every panelist has a chance to respond. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It was really very wonderful and intelligent question. Now, you understand that one person a person with intellectual and developmental disability, one problem is comprehension. It's very difficult for them to understand, depending on the type, the level, and the degree of their intellectual disability. Now, for this person, we have what we call easy to read. We have what we call easy to read versions. When you're designing your reporting mechanism, you also have to design an easy to read version for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. That is the first thing. Secondly, there is the need to make this person understand in a language at a level they can understand, learn their rights. And then this is what is good, this is what they should be, this is what they are able to do. You come at their level. There is always a level at which every person with intellectual and developmental disability can understand. Come down to that level, communicate with them on that level, and they will get it. The next thing falls to the parents and other stakeholders in the lives of these individuals to do their part. If you can put these three factors together, there will be a better level of safeguarding for persons with intellectual and developmental disability than we have in our society today. Over to Sylvia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon, for that very insightful response. That's all we have time for you today, everyone. Thank you so much again, Oluchi. Thank you, Dr. Deji, Madam Lois, and Mr. Solomon, for your very informative presentations, and to all of you, our dear audience, for your very engaging questions. We will be sharing a poll with you shortly, and we would crave your indulgence to kindly fill out this poll. It's a very brief poll, and this would help to tailor our services to suit you and to continue to improve the events that we deliver. Whilst you're completing these polls, please be informed that we will be sharing this webinar recording and slides with all of you, as well as other related resources. And like I mentioned earlier, all the questions that have not been answered on this live webinar will also be answered and shared with all of you. If you want to hear about future RSH webinars, subscribe to our newsletter. The link would be dropped in the chat shortly. Thank you, and hope to connect with you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to connect with you soon. And bye from us all. Do have a great day and week ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. We're just trying to give just one few extra seconds for those who are still feeling the pull to please do so. Thank you so much. But in the meantime, we will stop the recording.